And thank you, Stephanie. Joining me now is former U.S. Marshal Matthew Fogg. He is no stranger to the BNC family here. Thank you again for joining us. Always a pleasure. Let's just dive right in. Let's talk about a little bit of what we heard from Stephanie's piece. The murder of George Floyd sent millions into the streets worldwide with calls for reform. Quickly following it, how did that affect officers on the beat just walking the community?
But I think a lot of officers, I mean, especially me with the 30 years that I've been on board, um, we understood that there was racial disparities in the way we were policing. But I think everybody knew that and understood it. It's just that it was sort of like that hidden, as we call it, the blue wall of silence. You don't bring up anything that will taint a police department. But I think a lot of law enforcement officers, I mean, saw this guy do exactly what he did, and we know there's a lot of this stuff that it happens that has happened many times that just was never on the camera. So I think it did affect a lot of officers from the standpoint of realizing the public was now aware of it and coming out and letting police know that we don't no longer want you to operate like this.
Yeah, well, our calls were finally justified by that video that this has been happening to us. Mr. Fogg, I also want to ask you, we saw police reform at both the state and local level. We've talked about this previously, but slow motion on the federal side of things. What are your thoughts?
Well, the bottom line is, I mean, we have the George Floyd Protection Act that is in Congress. They've changed the name somewhat, changed it around, but the reality of it is it's getting held up in the Senate. And we see, again, racism affects not only law enforcement, it affects our congressional, it affects what our lawmakers do. So when we look at these paradigms of how communities are policed, and we can see the issues that take place and how we direct a lot of our target, a lot of our enforcement operations in African American neighborhoods. As I've always said, when I was working in the war on drugs, had we gone into white neighborhoods and policed the same way, they would have really corrected this stuff. They would have corrected these improprieties and these issues. The problem is, as long as you just direct stuff towards African Americans, a lot of times nobody's saying much about it, and it just becomes a powder keg to where it blows up to what we're seeing on these video cameras and the public getting involved.
But why? Why, Mr. Fogg? Why is it that when it comes to black and brown people feeling the brunt of a knee on their neck, that it just falls on deaf ears? Why is that? As someone in law
Well,
enforcement.
again, right. Well, again, we talk about the divide in America. America is very divided on law enforcement. I mean, when we look at why law enforcement was started, we can look back in the history and see it was basically started to basically control black folks because they knew that they were released from slavery. They had no reparations. So they knew these folks was going to need, supplies and things. So white folks became very concerned, said we need the police and we need to make certain that we stop them from coming into white neighborhoods, as well as make sure that we put as many of them as in prison. We built one of the largest prison industrial complexes on the backs of African Americans, and I was a part of that. All of us, police officers, black and white, we were all a part of putting these people in prison instead of making sure they had jobs and everything else. But that's a part of the racial, the systemic stuff that the President of the United States spoke about, systemic racism that's in America that we have to address, and for too long we've been playing like it doesn't exist.
All right, I guess my last question for you, Mr. Fogg, is where do we go from here? Because you've mentioned how divided the country is. We've seen, or better yet, we continue to see the George Floyd Policing Act just stall. It
Right.
hasn't been passed. We're also seeing voting rights stalling as well. So as a former law enforcement officer, how do we take care of ourselves? What do we do?
Well, the bottom line is we got to get involved. I mean, I tell people at the protesting, I was for it when you talk about Black Lives Matter. If you notice, the minute that started happening, bills started coming through Congress, people started doing things. The moment everybody got quiet, stopped protesting, stopped going out, speaking out on this stuff, then everything goes back to normal. We got to step out. We got to speak out. People have to come out and say, listen, it has not been fixed. And until it gets fixed, we will be protesting as one congressman said, good trouble, whatever you call it. The bottom line is we need to be out front making certain organizations. I'm with blacks in government. All these NAACP, they need to step up to the plate and they need to call a spade and say, listen, Until this stuff is corrected, you will hear from us over and over again.
Mr. Fogg, I appreciate that, but when we protest, we also saw laws coming out against that. For instance, in Florida, the anti-Black Lives Matter law, which basically says if a protester is in the street giving authority to a driver, that could hit them.
Right. Well, whenever you stand up and you protest, there's always going to be backlash. We've seen that in America. I saw that in my job. Bigots with badges right behind me. The name of my book talks all about this type of racism in law enforcement. The moment you speak up, somebody else is going to come from the other side and say, "Hey, you should not be doing that." So you expect that. The bottom line is that should not keep us from protesting, because we see that when we protest, as we broke the back of the South in Jim Crow, when we protested the buses, the Montgomery bus boycott, there was a lot of pushback, but we did it. And we have to make sure that we don't let anything stop us from continuing to make this issue front page in America.
Mr. Fogg, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us, sir.